Hello everyone and welcome to another ZBRUSH speed sculpt video. And for this video we're going to be discussing the thoughts and process behind recreating ZINOGRE based on the Monster Hunter World ICEBORNE concept art. So first things first, as a little bit of context here, this model is related to a new style I've been trying out over the last couple of days or weekend now, and this is the third of such style. So there are actually two other models I've done before this, which kind of better illustrate the style I'm going for. I keep calling it a style, more like a change of technique and a change of approach to how I model things. So this is going to be a bit more of a refined process, although saying that, with it being ZINOGRE of all things, this was really ambitious and I felt the pressure multiple times throughout this model. Generally speaking, one thing I'd like to do for 2020 is to make more fan art in general. As much as I really enjoy making my own concepts and obviously commissions as well, I really love doing commissions, but they're the only times I really feel challenged. I feel like I have to do things particularly differently. So by doing fan art, not only do I get to like really try and make new things, different things in ways I would never normally think of, but it also means I can make more familiar things that other people can enjoy as well. Now, like I said, this is my third one, despite being the first one showing on YouTube due to, you know, obviously the timing of ICEBORNE and everything. Gotta get out that hype train, come on. So, despite this one being the third one, the other two, if you've been following me on Discord, Twitter, or just Instagram, anywhere to be honest, if you follow me anywhere else other than YouTube, then you'll already know what the previous two are. And therefore, the general kind of new approaches I've been going for. So like I said, ZINOGRE was a far more ambitious one. The reason being was that it's overall just a lot more detailed. Now, when I looked at ZINOGRE initially, I can see all the detail, you know, I can see all the spikes, I can see all the hair, the fur, how a lot of the different features were like very intertwined and overlapping. And I looked at that and thought, you know, challenge accepted. I'd be more than happy to give it a go. But as progressing onwards and actually making the model itself, like I said, it did prove to be more ambitious, and I did come across quite a few, I wouldn't say problems, more like hurdles and concerns along the way. One of my biggest concerns overall was the fact that the general technique I've been going for recently is far more simple. It has a very rich colour scheme, which I gotta say I'm absolutely in love with. But when it comes to the models themselves, they're much more simple to look at. I normally do like a lot of scales, a lot of detailing, all sorts of like physical textures, all that kind of stuff. I normally try to make my models on a bit more of the semi-realistic side, or at least as close to as I possibly can. Obviously I'm still learning, but that's the typical style I like to go for. Whereas to these ones here, I've been focusing on a very distinctly more simple style, which like I said is one I've really been enjoying. Now when it came to doing this with ZINOGRE, it was tricky because, like I said, there's a lot of intertwining patterns, a lot of intertwining features like the fur and the spikes, and that did conflict quite a bit with the style, or at least I thought it did. When it came down to the very end, in the end, I really like how it came out. But it's one of those things, isn't it, where you're gonna keep on persisting and just hope that it will work out in the end, and this took a very long time for me to gain confidence in it. I very much liked the entire process and I really liked the progress I was making, but for a very large portion of this model, for one reason or another, I was concerned about how the final outcome would look, because once again, I felt like it may be a major clash in terms of themes and styles. And no one really likes a cluttered or mishmash kind of style. That never really looks any good. But that was my big concern. This particularly happened as I started making, started doing the spikes. I think it was these spikes around the tail, the very large broad tail, by the way, that was quite interesting to do on its own. I've never done a broad flat tail before, and I feel like it came out well enough in this in the end, but it really did force me to rethink a couple of things, such as you can see right now. I initially made the tail using the Z-spheres. I used two symmetrical bits of Z-spheres, tried to create the two independent tails, so you see like 4 tails in total, but then create a big webbing in between the two of them. As it turned out in the end, I was actually quite redundant because, as it turns out, a lot of the tail ended up getting completely covered in fur and spikes anyway. But I still needed our baseline. By the stage in the model, I wasn't really aware of the complications I'll experience later on. So in this phase, I'm still blocking out the general basics of the shapes. Speaking of blocking out, one of the major styles or major techniques I've been using here with these 3 fan art creations I made recently, so this one and the previous 2, the whole blocking out thing, you know, just using primitive tools, primitive shapes like spheres, blocks, etc. Normally, I tend to warp my models a lot. I'll take a sphere and I'll warp it and I'll warp it and I'll dynamesh it and I'll warp it again and again. For those of you who are not familiar with the technical terms, essentially I'm just dragging it and stretching it until I want it to be what I want it to be. And that can have some rather, let's just say, impurities here and there. It might not always be the most consistent shape, or just generally it could have like a couple of little bits that are off about it. Whereas recently I've been trying to do the whole primitive thing, so I'm just using these large pre-made blocks or spheres or cylinders and then merging or moulding that into the shape I want and piecing them together, but distinctly not merging them. And it has proven to be really beneficial, and as I get more practice with it, a lot faster as well. I generally get much rounder, much better defined shapes. I'm able to jump into higher poly a lot faster because I get to retain all the curvature, because the curvature has already been created, it's already been defined. As you can see right here, while the model is currently very basic, you can see all the distinct different layers and subtools and such. While it's clearly unfinished and clearly very blocky in a way, if you pay attention to the silhouette is pretty much, you know, bang on. It's pretty much the way I want it to be. Everything, like all the curvature is there, all the points and spikes are there. They've not been properly merged and blended into each other. So for example, right now, the 2 jaws are distinctly separated and there isn't any merging between, you know, upper jaw and lower jaw. But the silhouette is in place, you can see the overall shape is correct. And like I said, this has just been really, really convenient, really handy and really valuable to learn. And it does mean that I can jump into higher poly much faster because the shape is already defined. All I have to do is stitch them together. Like I said, it might be a little bit technical or even a bit rambly. But point being, this has been a extremely useful thing to learn, and I'll definitely be applying this to all the models from now on. Not just, you know, these more cartoonish, simplified ones, but just all models, because it is simply more convenient and far more time efficient. And while I do not believe in rushing, I do believe in being time efficient, especially when it comes to commissions. The last thing I want to do is take too long on a thing. I'd rather learn how to do it quickly, but do it right, and this feels like a really good step in that direction. On that note, currently we're looking at the head. Can I just say, the head, as cool as it was really, really tricky. In fact, I do believe this is where my trepidations first began. So, the head. Overall, it was quite straightforward. I was able to just keep on checking various different concept art, various different models of game, various different fan art as well. Just cross-referencing everything to make sure I got the right count of teeth. Well, not teeth, more like the little jawed appendage thingamabobs, you know, like the outer layer of teeth essentially. The right number of spikes, the coloration, etc. And overall, like I said, a lot of the details were quite straightforward, but this is where I started to get my concern in regards to things being a bit too complicated. There's a lot of information going around with the teeth. Not just the teeth themselves, but the outer teeth as well. Not to mention the ear, which distinctly, I'm actually not sure if this is correct or not, but from what I interpreted in all the fan art and concept art, etc., as far as I can tell, the ear kind of connected to the cheekbone, which was a little bit unusual. I think it looks really cool personally, but that was a bit unexpected. So little features like that, which kind of added to the complexity. That's a point actually, the eyebrows as well. You'll notice that right now the eyebrows are their own distinct subtool. And I actually kept that for the entire way through, because what I found is that by having the eyebrows as their own distinct subtool, it kept every bit of crease and curvature, and overall it just looked better moving forward. Now, I do want to mention, I did keep on saying about how I was going for a more simplistic idea, and yet you can currently see how I've added some ridges to the face. When I say simplistic, I suppose it's kind of hard to really define without seeing the actual final end result. Basically, simplistic in the sense that it matches something similar to Pokemon. In fact, one of my earlier models was a Pokemon, so that's actually a really good example. You know how in Pokemon, all the different colours are all their own distinctive shapes. That is basically the style I'm going for here. So, say for example, in a Pikachu, you notice how the Pikachu is just all yellow. Then it's got the distinct brown stripes, and if you were to do that in a mod, it'd probably make the stripes its own independent layer, independent subtool. That way it's like a nice clear-cut, bold colour. It won't bleed or transition at all into the yellow. You know, it's really nice and defined. The same for the red cheeks. You would again make the red cheeks, their own individual layer as well. Again, that way the colours don't bleed. That's essentially what I'm going for here. That, and of course, the lack of scales, the lack of fur, or at least, you know, or like hair-like filaments or that kind of stuff. Just overall, like a very solid-looking model. But that doesn't mean that I can't add a couple of like more subtle things, like the ridges on the snout, the how it's kind of snarling a bit, or the curvature, or the transition between like the jaw teeth, the outer teeth, I don't know how to call them, or the chin spike. Again, like I'm kind of losing my wording here. You know, the big spikes on the lower jaw, the little transitional ring in between the spikes and the jaw itself. Little things like that, alright? All these kind of things are like very subtly defined, and they don't really count to me as anything too detailed because they're not really like any scales or any fur or skin texture or whatever. Because overall, you can see that the model is pretty much flat, very, very smooth. Speaking of that, the horns. The horns were my first real big major hurdle, mainly because they were a very unique style that I had no idea how to do. Fortunately, I had the idea very, very quickly to just simply add a mask in and then kind of pull that mask inwards, or invert it and pull it inwards. That way I kind of like created a bit of a concave recess instead of defining the ridges themselves. I think that, in the end, ended up being the better choice. I think it just made things a bit easier to deal with. And then, of course, using the clay polish tool to make it all look, you know, not quite as bumpy and rigid. Actually, that's a point. One of the major things I've been using a lot when it comes to these models is the clay polish tool. So for those not familiar, the clay polish tool essentially kind of realigns the polygons and really helps to emphasize certain features such as creases, spikes, tips, etc, etc. And whereas Dynamesh will kind of remesh the entire thing, kind of like reposition everything into a very nice clear-cut, you know, like pattern of squares, where it's like very, very linear and it's kind of hard to describe. Whereas clay polish will warp the polygons for you into such a way that will better complement the curvature of the model. It's definitely one of those, you know, you kind of have to see it to understand it kind of situations, and I can't really demonstrate it in a speed sculpt. It's something that you really should experience for yourself. So if you are a ZBrush user, I'd really recommend just trying out clay polish and seeing how you can utilize it for yourself. I think it's really good for like adding like a bit of a finishing touch, but only as a finishing touch. It's you can't really sculpt with it after you use it because it does tend to warp a little bit, just get a bit distorted. Speaking of warping and distorting, mates, the fur on the arms and legs. So this is the beginning of the fur and all these spikes. Now the spikes, like I said, the face was when I first started to get a bit concerned in regards to the clash of styles here. The spikes is where I got really concerned. So this sort of spike here, the little diamondy kind of shape, was actually about my third or fourth attempt. I cut out the others, but ended up just being redundant footage. But in essence, I tried making these different variant types of spikes that I could then repeat along the entirety of the body. ZINOGRE has spikes going along his hands up to his arm, his toes up to his knees, and then even more like down his upper neck, his spine, all the way to the tip of his tail. It's got lots of spikes and a very defining feature. So since I had a defining feature, I thought to myself, okay, they shouldn't be too simple then, should they? They should have like a bit of complexity to them. But then, that it's very, very repetitive, very dominant feature, and if I had it be too detailed, that really would have been, you know, too much of a conflict of styles. So in the end, I just had to go with this very simple diamond shape and just hope that would be enough. And in the end, I think it was enough, but like I said, I really did have my concerns. You can see the process I'm going for right now, which is a simple case of duplicate, rotate, maybe change the size a little bit or change the length, etc., distort it a little bit, but otherwise it was really, really consistent, just lots and lots of repetitiveness. And that is something I've actually experienced from Spore, of all things. Funnily enough, even in Spore, there is something very appealing about a repetitive pattern, or patterns in general. And I think that kind of came into play here. So by having this one particular thing repeated multiple times into a pattern, it did end up looking quite nice, quite appealing. But like I said though, it was quite tricky, and I had like major concerns here. I also used the same piece for the plating around the bottom of the neck, or the underneath of the neck. That was just a bit of a happy guess, to be honest. I just figured, hey, maybe this will work, and it did, so I was actually really happy about that. In hindsight, the neck was probably something I actually probably could have left out. I'm glad I had it. I think it's good that I did keep it in there in the end. But for the general style that I've been going for, the neck was actually a bit more of a subtle detail. At least the plating on the neck. I think I really could have gotten away with it just being like rather plain. But you guys know me, I like to try and get as many details or features as I can. Speaking of features, the fur. The fur was probably my least favourite part of this. Mainly because I'm just not very good at fur anyway. And I find fur just to be like quite clunky to do. I'm really not very experienced in doing sculpted fur. That being said though, I did give it a go. The technique I'm using here actually stemmed from my previous model before this one, which, like I said, isn't on YouTube yet unfortunately, but if you follow me elsewhere you will know which one that is. It will be on YouTube very, very soon. And I have to do like a certain little bit of a flame effect. And the flame effect I entirely just winged. It was purely improvised and it went really well on the first try. And I was able to use that same technique on the fur here, and I think once again it actually worked out. Mainly because of the clay polish tool as well. You see me defining all these like little random lines and highlights and such. And then I use a clay polish tool to like kind of tidy it up and make it into a bit of a more, you know, nicer flow. And I think it worked out. I think it could be better, but I'm just not really that good when it comes to fur, unfortunately. I need a lot of learning in that regard. So I think, given my current, skill level, I think it came out quite nicely. That being said though, I do think the fur on the chest came out really well. There's something about that I think just had like a much better overall like appearance or finish. Now then, so at this stage in the model, I'm now finally merging parts together. And technically I did this a bit prematurely because one of the main new things about these models I've been doing recently is they're actually going to be posed. And I successfully posed them in the previous two models, but for this one I end up skimping out on it because again, another hurdle. As you can see right now, I'm currently trying to define the golden part of the arms, like the lower part of the arms or hand. I'm trying to define it a bit more into the spikes because, again, the textures and the different features are really intertwined. And therefore I had to merge the entirety of the arms and legs very, very early, sculpt it all in, define the edges, etc., like just overlapping, etc., all that kind of stuff. And the end result meant that it was going to be a lot harder for me to actually pose it later on. I probably could have done in the end, but what I mentioned earlier about the whole, building a primitives thing, using the spheres and the squares to keep everything separated, that did make posing things very, very convenient, like really less of a hassle. It does mean I have to define like certain areas twice, symmetrically. That's okay though, in the long term it did end up being much easier. But I couldn't do that with this because there was just too much going on, too much features, too much detail going on with the arms and legs, where I really couldn't afford to delay or, potentially make the two features asymmetrical. They kind of had to be symmetrical, and therefore it kind of locked me away from posing it. I wasn't aware of that in this stage of the model. Currently, right now, I'm just trying to focus on making everything work and just trying to add more and more features from ZINOGRE. I was so completely focused on that, and I unfortunately didn't really foresee that in the future I wouldn't be able to pose it. At this point I thought I would, but turns out not quite in the end. But to be honest, I'm quite okay with that. I do think this model kind of gets away with the lack of a posture, because in the end I think there's just so much going on with it that the posing just wasn't really that required. It would have been nice, it would have been a lot better if it did have a pose. The one I had in mind was completely based on the ICEBORNE concept art, where ZINOGRE is kind of hunched over in this exact pose, but looking towards the camera, like a little bit to the right. Unfortunately, couldn't really quite get that in here, but I think it's okay though. I think in this one scenario, I think it worked out fine. So, we've been doing a tremendous amount of talking in regards to the sculpt, and if I'm honest, I'm getting a little bit tired. But I think you can understand the general theme of what I'm saying here. So let's jump on to the colours then, shall we? Now, the colours are where this really shines, and it really just kind of like stitches everything together perfectly. something about this color technique I've just randomly picked up recently, and I absolutely love it. And it's really quite simple actually. As you can see right now, the model is very flat looking. It's because I've actually turned off all the shadows. I'm using the flat color material. And what that means is, by there being no shadows, now to define my own shadows. Now, this is something I normally get a bit concerned with, because the last thing you want to do is define shadows on a shadowed model, because that would technically then kind of double shadow it, or like really emphasize the shadow in a very unattractive way. So that's not really the goal here. More like I just wanted to like define colours. So with this ZINOGRE model, when it was rendered in its flat coloured, or let me rephrase that entirely. When it has its shadows as rendered with like very simple block colours, like one shade, one gradient, etc., it actually looks quite okay. I probably could have passed it off there and then. But what I've been learning recently is that even with these simplified models where it's got very, very simplistic colour schemes, if I enable the flat colour material and actually define all the colours and hues and shades and gradients, all that kind of stuff, if I define it myself, it actually makes the final thing look much richer in colour. Which is kind of funny, because the lighting and shadows are already defining the transitions anyway, but something about, you know, manually defining them like this just made it look so much richer. You can really see it a lot in just about everywhere, to be honest, actually, just about everywhere. I typically try to make the colours, you know, consistent to themselves. So for example, the gold was only gold, the blue was only blue, and the white was only white. I may have used like a couple of subtle tones, such as in the hair, in the white fur, I did use like a bit of blue tones here and there, just like make it a little bit different. In the blue scales, I did use a bit of green and a bit of purple. Actually no green, but I did use a bit of purple. Just again, very subtly. Very subtle hues, just to like, again, give it like a bit of a difference in the colour schemes. And then in the golden part, I actually did a bit of green around the feet, just to make the bottom of the feet look like a little bit muddied. That was something I had noticed in the concept art as well, and something I tried to take on board from that. And it's really subtle, but I think that in the very, very final ends, all those really tiny design choices really made a big difference. Also here, for example, you can see that I'm really highlighting and low lighting the hell out of the golden parts. And like I mentioned earlier, that's something I normally would be afraid to do, because I would think it would like really oversaturate the shadowing. But again, it's just something about it just really came out perfectly. It's another one of those, you're gonna have to see it to believe it kind of moments here. That being said though, when it came to the golden parts, as you can currently see, the shadowing was not easy. Because I'd also have to do it neatly. Like you can see at this point here, I've completely redone the spikes along the back, because I did want to define the more hidden edges. I didn't want to add like a bit of a natural shadowing to those bits. But you have to do it properly though. Like even though these are very subtle hues, very subtle markers you're not really going to see in the final render, it still pays to have them just like be neat and tidy. And that's what I end up doing here. So you can see now it's like a much better, much cleaner kind of transition, much better defined, etc, etc. And in the final finish, you can just tell, man, you can just tell it just looks better. That is a major thing I've been learning when it comes to these models, these last 3 fan-out models, is the subtlety of texturing. And can I just say, I don't really know where it's come from either. Like a lot of this has been very improvised, been quite instinctual, to be like a lot of instincts kind of played in here. I've always been a big fan of texturing. I've always really enjoyed texturing as a thing. It's probably my favourite part of making a model is, you know, get all the colours in. But something about these latest couple of models, it just felt so much richer. And it's something that I wish I could explain better. I really do. But hopefully by seeing the process here, you get like a bit more of an understanding of it. Now working on the blue. So you can see once again here, if now the underneath of the blue would be shadowed anyway, I'm still defining it, because at the end of the day, no skin tone is ever the same consistent colour throughout. So I feel like that making the underbit a bit darker, just as again like a bit more transition, a bit more subtlety. It really helps define the facial features a lot better, helps define the ridges a little bit better. Doesn't rely entirely on the shadows of the renderer, but also it allows it to build up the shadows by itself. You'll see right here actually, I'm now using a very bright, vivid blue to mark the face. That is not something I'd normally do, and it again does get kind of hidden by the renderer shadows in the end anyway. But once again, by having that nice big defined blue, it just really makes the face pop out a bit more. Also, the ridges around the legs, again, a big pain in the butt shadowing, but again, it just pays off later. And as mentioned earlier, you can see like a bit of purple being shifted in around here and there as well. I did add a bit of purple around the underbelly to complement that around the neck. The neck is actually purple anyway, so that kind of fitted in the end. But by adding a bit of purple into various other parts of the body, it just kept it like being a little bit more consistent. And some very subtle shades of purple around the back legs in the more heavier, denser armoured pieces. Again, that was just to break up the monotony. The next two models coming up next will not be quite as lengthy, but because ZINOGRE was such an ambitious project, there was a lot more to describe. In fact, before we head off, there is one more important thing to note, and that with ZINOGRE, I did do one thing I've not done to the other models, and that is to introduce a little bit of texture to the skin. So I made a big emphasis earlier on about how I didn't want to add scales or anything like that. But Monster Hunter does have like a very classic, dirty kind of appearance. In that a lot of the monsters do have like a very mottled appearances. Got like a lot of browns, a lot of greens, got like a lot of impurities in their skin. And in the end, that was something that I did want to include in this one. So what you'll find, very subtle, is particularly around the blue, but also around the gold and white, is you'll find like this little dot. You can see a little bit on the shoulder right now, or have like a little bit of a grey dotting. Right now it doesn't quite defined, but then when it's all rendered and shadowed, the dots are somewhat overpowered by the shadows themselves, so they do come across as quite subtle in the end. And all that does, it just breaks up the smoothness of the texturing. I do want the textures to be smooth, that is very important, but by adding just a little bit of impurities, it just makes, it just does something. I don't really know how to describe. Again, it was one of those instinct moments where I don't know why I wanted to do this thing, I just did and it worked out. Like I said, I really like texturing. But by adding the impurities here and there, even a smooth model like this, again, it just helped tie everything together and just made it look a bit more complete in the end. As I said, really hard to describe. I wish I could describe it better. But I think we can all agree that when seeing the very final product, the fair bit of impurities here and there, as well as the overall transition and gradient of texture just look great in the end. Alright then, now I've been talking for long enough. I'm pretty sure I'm slurring at this point, so I do apologise for that. But like I said, there was a lot to just discuss with this one. And I really hope that it was something to learn, something interesting, or at the very least, I hope it's good to listen to. This was a very ambitious project. I'm really happy with the results. I'm so proud of it. Like, given the style I was going for, I think it really came out fantastic in the end. And I'm not going to do it again, not for a while. So guys, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for listening. As always, I'll see you all next time. And by the way, let me know, what Monster Hunter creature would you like to see next? Have a wonderful day, and take care.